Do you want now name place names? Yes, yes, yes. I love this. Another sign of our great depth of multiculturalism in Sri Lanka. It's absolutely stunning how many different types of place names we have. Anybody who's anyone has anyone been to? Does anyone live in Colombo? Has lived in Colombo? Can I see if anyone can raise their hand? See how many of you have lived in Colombo? No, nobody. Okay. So I grew up in Colombo, and nearly every place name in Colombo is of of a non-Sri Lankan origin. So Bloemendal and Wolfendal means Valley of the Wolves, Valley of the Flowers in Dutch. Punto Pedro and Passo Grande, which is Grand Pass, right? Grand Pass used to be called Passo Grande in Portuguese times. Then we have the names of different islands around Sri Lanka. Heights, Delft, Hammenheel. These are all different words in Dutch. Of course, there are Tamil and Sinhala place names, which I won't focus on because they're very much more in our consciousness. But then there are Malay place names like Jawata, Jayala, and a huge amount of Scottish place names because Sri Lanka had a huge influence from Scotland and the people of Scotland who settled the various tea estates and worked on the tea estates there. So an example here is Glen Aber Place, which Randika found on the internet. But there's so many other places like that. So the next time you're in Sri Lanka and you look at places like Havelock Town, Kent Street, Slave Island, just take note of how diverse, how much that indicates our cultural mixing. I'd just like to also throw in the word Beruwala, which goes back to an old Moorish name, right? And even the island of Sri Lanka, really Sri Lanka in its entirety has been called so many things: Serendip, Taprobana, Ceylon, and so on. Again, showing that we were part of the greater scheme of the world's trading networks, and therefore inevitably connected. Architecture, like we've got a huge amount of diverse types of architecture in Sri Lanka. So the Madhamidula is a very good example. The Madhamidula, which many of us have in our houses or have seen, goes back to the architecture found in historical southern India, so Kerala and so on. They've got Madhamidul in their houses as well, out in Kerala. The Galle Fort was one of the best examples of Portuguese fort building. Then we had the Tintagel and the Independence Square designed by Parsi Sri Lankans. So I think we wrote an article about this a while ago. But the Parsi community has been very influential in Sri Lankan history, especially in architecture. Then we think of the architecture of Geoffrey Bawa and his works. And of course, even things that are not necessarily made of brick and mortar, but are actually part of our integral Sri Lankanness. For example, on the island of Mannar, there are 500-year-old baobab trees. Now, these trees aren't native to Sri Lanka. They were brought there from the African continent by Moorish traders over half a millennium ago. And there's a little forest of these baobabs on Mannar Island, which is now protected, which is a testament to that ancient mixing. And the Dutch Canal network. So when I was wandering through Negombo, I saw these canals and I was thinking, what are these canals about? Turns out they were part of the old Dutch canal system. And when I did my research, it turned out that they're hundreds of years old, built in the mid 1600s. Just a quick story, I think that you might appreciate. Each of these things allows us to connect with other people, even these architectural monuments. And how this Dutch canals helped me connect with people was one day I was wandering through, I was actually climbing Sigiriya, and I met a Dutch couple. And we started talking about Sri Lanka's Dutch history. And as we were talking about it, I told them about the Dutch Canal network. And you could see them almost beaming with pride. And then this man, he had a really pensive look to his face. He looked off to the distance and he said, "Oh, this Dutch canal system, it's been there for how many years?" And I said, it's been there for about 300 or so years. And then he looked at me and he said, "Good architecture, no?" And then we had a good laugh. And in that moment, I connected with the guy, right? Because I was connecting with a Dutchman over the fact that hundreds of years ago, his people came and built this canal in Sri Lanka, which is still there and still being used. We still use it. And it's the same thing with all these other things. I've connected with people from Kerala over the Madamidula. I've gone and talked to people about the ancient railways of Sri Lanka and how Afghan Sri Lankans built it, right? So I've gone and talked to people about the Hindu temples of Sri Lanka and other places, and immediately you have this connection, which is so unique. There's very few countries in the world where you can just go and talk about something that's in your country that immediately gives you a link to somebody else who's in a completely different place.